The chamber stretched out before Daniel crossed like a cathedral built by gods who had forgotten humility. 12 thrones rose from the polished floor, each one carved from materials that Earth had no names for. The beings that sat upon them represented civilizations that had mastered the stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. Daniel stood alone in the center of the room with his hands clasped behind his back and his dress uniform pressed and perfect. He had worn this uniform with pride when he left Earth 3 months ago. Now it felt like a burial shroud. The air tasted wrong here. The atmospheric processors created something breathable for humans, but it carried the scent of ozone and something else. Something organic and ancient that made his skin crawl. Above him, the dome showed the swirling colors of the nebula that housed the council station. Purple and gold clouds of gas twisted in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Now they just reminded him how far from home he was. Earth was 6 weeks away at maximum speed. 6 weeks he did not have. Vexthor rose from the central throne. The Krillian stood nearly 3 meters tall with a body that resembled a praying mantis, crossed with something from a nightmare. Its 4 eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was both ancient and cruel. The translator implant in Daniel's ear converted the clicking and buzzing sounds into words that dripped with contempt. The charges were simple: espionage, data theft, violation of council law. All of it was fabricated. Daniel knew it. The council knew it. The truth did not matter here. He had tried to speak in his defense an hour ago. The words had fallen on deaf ears, or whatever the alien equivalent was. The evidence they presented was damning and completely manufactured. Files on his personal datapad that he had never created. Communications logs showing transmissions to Earth intelligence agencies that had never happened. Testimony from witnesses who claimed to have seen him in places he had never been. It was a masterpiece of deception, and Daniel understood why. Humanity had made the council nervous. 3 years ago, the first alien ship had appeared in Earth orbit. The arrival had been peaceful, the intentions seemingly benign. The council presented themselves as guardians of galactic civilization, maintainers of peace and order among the stars. They offered humanity a place in their grand design. Though a junior place, a subordinate place, Earth would be welcomed as children are welcomed to a table of adults. Be quiet, be grateful, be obedient. That was the unspoken message beneath all the diplomatic language. Earth had played along. The governments had smiled and nodded and signed the treaties. But behind closed doors, other decisions were made. Humanity had not survived ice ages and world wars and planetary disasters by trusting strangers. The military had begun to prepare. The scientists had begun to study. The engineers had begun to build. And someone on the council had noticed. Daniel could see it now, standing in this chamber with his death sentence already decided. This was not about justice. This was about sending a message. The upstart humans needed to learn their place. They needed to understand that questioning the council brought consequences. They needed to see what happened to those who did not know when to bow. And what better way to teach that lesson than to execute their ambassador in front of the entire galaxy? Vexthor's speech continued. The translator converted the words, but Daniel barely heard them anymore. His mind was working through the implications, calculating the aftermath. Earth would see this. The broadcast was going out on all council networks, and humanity had access to those networks. Billions of people would watch him die. His wife Carol would watch. His daughter Susan would watch. President Mitchell would watch. And they would all have to make a choice about what to do next. The other council members began to vote. One by one, the representatives of civilizations that spanned star systems raised their appendages or glowed their bioluminescence, or broadcast their assent through whatever method their species used. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word repeated 12 times, unanimous. Daniel had expected nothing less. This trial had been decided before it began. He was not here to receive justice. He was here to be an example. 2 guards approached him. They were Draxian reptilian creatures with scales that shimmered like oil on water. They grabbed his arms with claws that could have torn through steel. Daniel did not resist. There was no point. The execution would be carried out immediately. The council believed in swift justice, which was easier when the verdict was predetermined. They led him to a platform that rose from the floor. The mechanism was ancient, older than human civilization, used countless times over thousands of years for this exact purpose. As they strapped him to the platform, Daniel's fingers moved carefully against his palm. The gesture looked like a nervous twitch, nothing more. But it activated the emergency beacon in his neural implant, a piece of technology the Council did not know about because they had never bothered to scan deeply enough. They saw humans as primitives, barely worthy of the advanced technology they had been given. They never imagined that humanity might have technology of their own. The connection opened. Daniel could feel it, a whisper at the back of his mind. The signal was bouncing through quantum relays hidden in the infrastructure of the Council station itself. Relays that human engineers had secretly installed during the construction of Earth's embassy wing. The message would reach Earth in minutes, not weeks, and it would contain everything. The fabricated charges, the sham trial, the execution, and 2 words that Daniel transmitted with every ounce of will he possessed. Protocol Nightfall. The execution device hummed to life. Daniel could see the energy building, a soft blue glow that grew brighter with each passing second. He thought of Carol and Susan. He thought of Earth, that small blue marble in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. He thought of all the people who would watch this and feel anger rise in their chests like wildfire. The Council thought they were making an example. They thought they were teaching humanity a lesson about power and place and the natural order of the cosmos. They were wrong. The energy discharged. For a fraction of a second, Daniel Cross felt everything. Then he felt nothing at all. His body slumped against the restraints. The guards released him and let him fall to the platform. Vexthor gestured and the body was removed, discarded like refuse. The Council members began to file out of the chamber, satisfied that justice had been served and order maintained. None of them noticed the small smile that had crossed Daniel's face in that final moment. None of them understood what they had just done. 6 light-years away, alarms began to sound in a bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. Lieutenant Commander Kate Morris stared at her screen as the message decoded itself. Her hands shook as she reached for the red phone that connected directly to the Pentagon. When Admiral Vincent Hayes answered, she spoke 3 words that changed everything. We received nightfall. The Situation Room beneath the White House had been built to withstand nuclear war. Its walls were reinforced concrete 3 meters thick, lined with enough electromagnetic shielding to block any signal that might try to penetrate. Right now it felt more like a tomb than a command center. President John Mitchell sat at the head of the table, with his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Around him, the faces of his cabinet reflected the same barely controlled rage that he felt burning in his chest. The main screen still showed the execution. Someone had mercifully paused it at a frame before the final moment, but Daniel Cross's face was frozen there for everyone to see. He looked calm. That was what struck Mitchell the most. The ambassador had faced his death with more dignity than his murderers had shown in carrying it out. The president had known Daniel personally. They had served together in the Marines decades ago, back when the stars were just lights in the sky and not destinations humanity could reach. Admiral Vincent Hayes stood beside the screen with a tablet in his hands. The man was 70 years old, but he carried himself like he was still the fighter pilot who had flown missions over hostile territory. His voice was steady as he spoke, laying out the intelligence reports that had been flooding in for the past 2 hours. The Council had been planning this for months. They had monitored Earth's development and decided that humanity was advancing too quickly. The charges against Daniel were just an excuse. The execution was a warning. Stay in your place or face extinction. Secretary of Defense Lisa Grant tapped her fingers on the table. She was a former prosecutor who had built her career on finding the truth in complicated situations. Right now, the truth was simple and brutal. The Council saw humanity as a threat and they had chosen to act first. The question was not whether Earth would respond, but how. She pulled up a document on her own tablet and projected it onto the secondary screen. 3 options, each one carrying risks that could reshape human civilization forever. Option 1 was diplomatic protest. Earth could condemn the execution, demand justice, and threaten to withdraw from all Council agreements. It was the safe choice, the civilized choice, and everyone in the room knew it was worthless. The Council had just murdered a human ambassador on false charges. They would not care about strongly worded letters and economic sanctions. They had already shown what they thought of human complaints. Option 2 was measured military response. Earth could strike a few Council installations, demonstrate their capabilities, and force the aliens to negotiate from a position of respect rather than contempt. It was a middle ground, a way to show strength without triggering total war, but it assumed the Council would respond rationally to force. Nothing about Daniel's execution suggested rational thinking. It suggested arrogance and a fundamental belief that humanity could be crushed if they stepped out of line. Option 3 was Protocol Nightfall. The name had been chosen carefully 3 years ago when the protocol was first drafted. Nightfall meant darkness. It meant the end of light. It meant that Earth would not simply defend itself, but would drag the entire Galactic Council into an abyss from which there was no return. The protocol called for immediate mobilization of every military asset humanity possessed, including the ones the Council did not know existed. It called for simultaneous strikes on multiple Council systems. It called for a demonstration of force so overwhelming that the aliens would have no choice but to surrender or face annihilation. Mitchell looked around the table. His Secretary of State wanted Option 1. His Chief of Staff suggested Option 2. But he could see in the eyes of his military advisors what they thought. Hayes did not even try to hide it. The Admiral had been one of the primary architects of Protocol Nightfall. He believed the Council would only understand one language, and that language was written in fire and steel in the cold mathematics of orbital mechanics. The President stood and walked to the window. It was not a real window, just a screen showing a feed from the surface. He could see the Washington Monument rising into the evening sky. Beyond it, invisible from this angle, was Arlington National Cemetery where thousands of soldiers rested. They had died defending Earth from human threats. Now humanity faced something far worse. He thought about Carol Cross watching her husband die. He thought about Susan Cross learning that her father had been murdered by aliens who considered themselves civilized. He thought about every person on Earth who had welcomed the Council with open arms and hopeful hearts, only to learn that kindness was seen as weakness among the stars. Mitchell turned back to the table. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. He had made his decision. Protocol Nightfall was activated immediately. The room erupted into controlled chaos as cabinet members grabbed phones and tablets and began issuing orders. Hayes was already on a secure line to NORAD, speaking in rapid commands that would set a military machine into motion. Grant was contacting the Joint Chiefs, making sure every branch understood what was about to happen. Within minutes, the authorization codes were sent. Within hours, the other nations of Earth would ratify the decision. Humanity had always been divided by borders and languages and old grudges, but this was different. This was existential. The asteroid belt installation received the signal first. Commander Greg Palmer had been expecting it since the moment he saw Daniel's execution broadcast. His crew had trained for 3 years in secret, living in cramped quarters inside an asteroid that was supposedly just a mining operation. The hangar doors began to open, massive slabs of rock and metal sliding apart to reveal the ships hidden inside. They were beautiful in a deadly way. All sharp angles and weapon arrays that looked nothing like the crude cargo haulers Earth had shown the Council. On Mars, Captain Linda Shaw watched her screens light up with activation sequences. The Olympus Mons facility had been disguised as a terraforming station. In reality, it was the largest military shipyard humanity had ever constructed. 50 vessels were docked there, each one more advanced than anything the Council believed Earth could produce. Her crew moved with practiced efficiency, running through pre-flight checks and weapons diagnostics. They had known this day might come. Now it was here. In the Kuiper Belt, Commander Richard Stone felt a grim satisfaction as his fleet powered up. His ships were the fastest in the human arsenal, equipped with quantum drives that could cross light years in days rather than weeks. They would be the first to strike, hitting Council positions before the aliens even realized Earth had responded. Stone had lost a brother in a training accident 2 years ago, killed by faulty Council technology that the aliens had assured humanity was safe. He had personal reasons for wanting this, and he was not ashamed of them. Back in the Situation Room, Mitchell watched the status boards update. Green lights appeared across the solar system as ships and stations reported ready status. The Council thought they knew what humanity was capable of. They had seen the public fleet, the dozen warships that Earth openly acknowledged. They had no idea about the other 85 vessels hidden throughout the solar system. They did not know about the weapons research that had been conducted in laboratories on Europa and Titan. They did not know that humanity had taken every piece of technology the Council had shared and improved it, weaponized it, turned it into tools of war. Hayes approached the president with a final report. 97 ships were operational and ready for deployment. Crews were at battle stations. Target packages had been distributed. The first wave would launch in 6 hours, timed to arrive at 12 Council systems simultaneously. It would be the largest coordinated military operation in human history, and it would announce to the galaxy that Earth was not a victim waiting to be subjugated. Mitchell signed the final authorization. There was no going back now. Across Earth, people watched the news with a mixture of fear and anger. The execution had been broadcast everywhere. Now the talking heads were speculating about what would happen next. Some called for peace, others demanded blood. In homes and bars and public squares, humanity was united in a way it had not been since the darkest days of the world wars. They had reached for the stars with hope. They had been answered with murder. The age of innocence was over. Deep in the Colorado mountains, Kate Morris coordinated communications between the scattered fleets. Her screen showed ships moving into position, quantum drives spinning up, weapon systems going hot. She thought about Daniel Cross and his final message. He had known what would happen. He had triggered the protocol knowing it would lead to war. But he had also known that sometimes peace was not possible with those who saw you as less than equal. Sometimes the only way to survive was to fight back harder than anyone expected. The countdown reached 0. The fleets began to jump. Captain Jake Peterson stood on the bridge of the EDS Retribution and felt the ship come alive beneath his feet. The vibration was subtle, more felt than heard as the quantum drive began its initialization sequence. Around him, his crew moved with the kind of precision that came from endless training and absolute dedication. They had drilled for this moment in simulators and war games for 2 years. Now it was real. The holographic display showed the ship's position relative to the asteroid belt, a swarm of rocks that hid the greatest secret humanity had ever kept from alien eyes. The Retribution was not just a warship. She was a statement. Every line of her hull had been designed with one purpose in mind: to prove that humanity could build something that would make the Council afraid. She was 200 meters long with armor plating that could withstand direct hits from plasma weapons. Her power core used fusion technology that Earth had developed independently, refusing to rely on Council designs. The weapons arrays that lined her flanks were a mixture of human innovation and brutal practicality. Railguns that could fire tungsten slugs at a fraction of light speed. Missile pods loaded with warheads that used antimatter in yields the Council had forbidden. Point defense lasers that could track and destroy incoming fire with computer precision. Chief Engineer Maria Santos called up from the engine room. Her voice was calm despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. The quantum drive was operating at optimal efficiency. All systems showed green across the board. The ship was ready to jump whenever Peterson gave the word. He acknowledged the report and looked at his tactical officer. Lieutenant Brandon Cole was young for his position, barely 30, but he had a gift for reading battle situations that the older officers recognized and respected. Cole's fingers danced across his console as he ran final diagnostics on the weapons systems. Outside the Retribution, the rest of the First Fleet was assembling. Peterson could see them on his display, 27 ships ranging from destroyers to heavy cruisers. Each one had been built in secret over the past 3 years, constructed inside hollowed-out asteroids using materials that were supposedly being mined for peaceful purposes. The Council had monitors throughout the solar system, but they saw what they expected to see. Mining ships, cargo haulers, scientific research stations. They never looked deeper. They never imagined that humanity would dare to deceive them. Commander Helen Price commanded the Second Fleet from Mars orbit. Her flagship was the EDS Defiance, a heavy cruiser that outmassed the Retribution by half. Peterson had served with Helen during the early days of Earth's Space Navy, when they were both fresh officers learning how to operate in zero gravity. She was one of the finest tactical minds in the fleet, and she had been given the most dangerous assignment. Her 30 ships would strike at the Council's military headquarters, a fortress station that protected the heart of their government. If anyone could crack that target, it was Helen. The communication link opened and Helen's face appeared on Peterson's screen. She looked tired but determined. Her crew had been running combat drills for 18 hours straight, making sure every system was perfect before they jumped into what would certainly be the fiercest fighting of the campaign. She asked Peterson if his fleet was ready. He confirmed they were. The small talk that followed was brief and professional. Two old friends who both knew they might not survive the next few days. They signed off with a simple exchange. See you on the other side. Count on it. Peterson walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, 12 council systems were going about their daily business, completely unaware of what was coming. Their defense fleets were probably running routine patrols. Their civilians were working and eating and sleeping, secure in the belief that the council's power was eternal and unbreakable. In a few hours, that belief would be shattered. Peterson felt no joy at the thought. This was not about revenge or glory. This was about survival. The council had declared through their actions that humanity had no right to exist as equals. Earth's response would teach them the cost of that arrogance. Navigation Officer Christine Ward announced that the jump coordinates were locked in. The fleet would emerge at the edge of the Krillian home system, close enough to strike but far enough out to avoid immediate detection. The Krillians were Vexthor's species, the ones who had orchestrated Daniel Cross's execution. They would be the first to learn what happened when you killed a human ambassador. Peterson gave the order to prepare for quantum jump. The crew acknowledged and began the final countdown sequence. Across the solar system, other fleets were making similar preparations. The third fleet under Captain Nicholas Hunt would hit the Draxian colonies. The fourth fleet under Commander Olivia Grant would strike the trade hub at Velon Prime. The fifth fleet under Captain Raymond Clark would attack the Council's research stations. Every target had been chosen carefully based on intelligence that Earth had been gathering since first contact. The goal was not just to inflict damage, but to send an unmistakable message. Humanity could reach any Council world. They could strike anywhere. There was nowhere the aliens would be safe if this war continued. In the crew quarters, the men and women of the Retribution made their own preparations. Some wrote letters that would be delivered to families if they did not return. Others checked and rechecked their equipment, finding comfort in routine tasks. A few gathered in small groups to pray, asking whatever gods they believed in for strength and protection. Most simply sat quietly with their thoughts, processing the reality that they were about to enter combat against an enemy that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years. The ship's chaplain, Lieutenant Kenneth Ross, moved through the sections offering words of encouragement and listening to confessions from those who needed to unburden themselves before battle. Peterson returned to his command chair and strapped himself in. The quantum drive was reaching full power now. He could feel it through the deck plates, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate in his bones. The theory behind quantum jumping was still not fully understood by human scientists. It involved folding space itself, creating a tunnel between 2 points that allowed a ship to cross vast distances in moments. The Council had shared the basic principles, but Earth's engineers had improved on the design, making drives that were faster and more reliable than the alien versions. It was typical of humanity's approach to every challenge. Take what you are given and make it better. The countdown reached its final seconds. Peterson's executive officer, Commander Alan Wright, called out the markers. 10 seconds. 5 seconds, 3, 2, 1, jump. The universe twisted around the Retribution. For a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, Jake Peterson existed in a state that human minds were not meant to perceive. Then reality snapped back and the ship was somewhere else. The main display showed a different star field. In the distance, a yellow sun burned bright and angry. Around it orbited 7 planets, including the green and blue world that was home to 3 billion Krillians. The tactical display began populating with contacts, defense satellites, orbital stations, patrol ships. The Krillians had a significant military presence around their home world, but it was configured for defense against conventional threats. They expected enemies to arrive through normal space, spending weeks crossing the system at sublight speeds. They never anticipated that an entire human fleet would appear at their doorstep with weapons hot and ready to fire. Brandon Cole reported 27 Council vessels in system, most of them concentrated near the planet. He highlighted 3 heavy cruisers that would be the primary threats. Peterson opened a channel to the rest of the fleet. His orders were simple and direct. All ships were to close to weapons range and engage at will. Priority targets were military installations and ships. Civilian infrastructure was to be avoided unless it posed a direct threat. Humanity was going to war, but they would not become monsters in the process. The distinction might seem small to some, but Peterson knew it mattered. When this was over, when the Council finally agreed to negotiate, Earth would need to prove they were better than their enemies. The Retribution's engines flared to life, and the ship surged forward. Around her, the other vessels of the First Fleet matched her acceleration. They moved in a formation that had been practiced 1,000 times, each ship positioned to provide covering fire for the others. The distance to the Krillian defense perimeter began to shrink rapidly. 5 million kilometers, 4 million, 3 million. Still, the enemy showed no sign of having detected them. The element of surprise was complete. At 2 million kilometers, the Krillian sensors finally picked up the human fleet. Peterson watched the enemy ships begin to react, turning to face the new threat and powering up their weapons. It was too late. The Retribution's railguns fired first, sending streams of tungsten slugs downrange at velocities that made them essentially impossible to dodge. The slugs crossed the distance in seconds and slammed into a Krillian destroyer. The impact was catastrophic. Armor plating shattered, hull breaches vented atmosphere into space. The destroyer tumbled out of formation, dead in the water. Brandon Cole was already acquiring the next target. The tactical computer identified a weapons platform, one of dozens that protected the approaches to the planet. The platform was old, probably decades past its optimal service life, but it still packed enough firepower to damage or destroy a human ship. Cole launched a spread of missiles. The warheads accelerated hard, their drives pushing them to speeds that stressed the limits of their structural integrity. Point defense lasers from the platform tried to intercept them, but the missiles were too fast and too numerous. 3 got through. The explosions lit up the darkness like miniature suns. All around the Krillian system, similar scenes were playing out as other human ships engaged their targets. The Council forces fought back with the desperation of those who suddenly realized they were facing an enemy far more dangerous than they had believed possible. But desperation was not enough. Humanity had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. They had studied Council tactics and strategies. They had identified weaknesses in alien ship designs. They had developed weapons specifically designed to counter Council defenses. Every advantage that the aliens thought they possessed was being systematically stripped away. Peterson allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction as another enemy vessel was torn apart by railgun fire. The Krillians were learning a lesson that humanity had learned long ago on Earth. Technology and numbers meant nothing without the will to use them effectively. The Council had grown complacent after millennia of unopposed rule. They had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival against an enemy that refused to surrender. Now they were being reminded, and the reminder was written in fire across their sky. The battle for the Krillian system had been raging for 6 hours when Captain Jake Peterson realized they were winning. The realization came not from the tactical display showing enemy vessels being destroyed, though there were plenty of those, but from the way the Krillian fleet was moving. They were pulling back toward the planet, clustering together in a defensive formation that sacrificed mobility for concentrated firepower. It was the tactical decision of a commander who had lost the initiative and knew it. Peterson had seen the same pattern in human naval battles studied at the Academy. When a fleet stopped trying to win and started trying to survive, the outcome was already decided. The Retribution shook as a plasma bolt glanced off her forward shields. The impact sent ripples of energy cascading across the defensive barrier, but the shields held. Maria Santos reported from engineering that the generators were operating at 70% capacity, with plenty of reserve. The Krillian weapons were powerful, but they were designed for a different kind of warfare. They expected battles to be fought at long range with ships maneuvering for hoe. Ours are days before decisive engagement. Human tactics were built on speed and aggression. Jump in close, hit hard, and keep moving before the enemy could respond effectively. Brandon Cole identified the next target, a Krillian heavy cruiser that was trying to organize a counterattack. The ship was larger than the Retribution, and probably carried twice the crew. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a formidable opponent. But these were not normal circumstances. Cole locked the railguns and fired a sustained burst. Dozens of tungsten slugs crossed the distance in seconds. The Krillian cruiser's shields absorbed the first few impacts but then collapsed under the sustained bombardment. The slugs tore through armor and into the ship's interior. Secondary explosions bloomed along the hull as ammunition stores and fuel cells detonated. The cruiser listed to one side and began venting debris. Across the Krillian system, the other human ships were reporting similar success. Commander Alan Wright coordinated the tactical net, collecting damage reports and redistributing targets to ensure no enemy vessel escaped attention. 3 human destroyers had taken significant damage and were withdrawing to safe distance for repairs. 1 frigate, the EDS Challenger, had been destroyed when a lucky shot from a Krillian missile penetrated her reactor shielding. All hands were lost. Peterson felt the weight of those deaths, but he could not dwell on them. The battle was still ongoing and his crew needed him focused. At the Council's central station, Admiral Patricia Lee was fighting a very different kind of battle. Her fleet of 20 ships faced 300 Council defenders, vessels drawn from a dozen different species and representing the military might of the entire galactic government. The odds were impossible by any conventional measure, but Patricia Lee had not built her career on following convention. She had earned her rank by thinking differently, by finding solutions where others saw only problems. Her flagship, the EDS Valiant, was positioned at the center of her formation. The ship was not the largest or the most heavily armed, but it had the most advanced electronic warfare suite in the human fleet. Patricia's plan relied on that technology. While the Council vessels maneuvered to bring their superior numbers to bear, the Valiant was broadcasting false sensor readings across every frequency the aliens used. The Council fleet was seeing phantom ships where none existed, tracking missile launches that were never fired, responding to threats that were pure fiction. Lieutenant Sophie Turner sat at the tactical station aboard the EDS Vengeance, one of Patricia's escort destroyers. Sophie was 26 years old, and this was her first real combat. The simulations had not prepared her for the way her hands shook or the way her heart hammered against her ribs. But her mind was clear and focused on the data streaming across her screens. She watched the Council fleet's movements and began to notice a pattern. When the flagship of a particular formation was destroyed, the surrounding ships fell into confusion. They stopped coordinating their fire. They broke formation. They became vulnerable. Sophie reported her observation to the fleet channel. Patricia Lee acknowledged immediately and updated the tactical priorities. All human ships were to focus fire on Council flagships. Take out the command vessels and let chaos do the rest. The strategy was brutal but effective. Within 30 minutes, 5 Council flagships had been destroyed, and their escort formations were in disarray. The Council commanders were trying to reorganize, but human jamming made communication difficult. Ships that had trained together for years suddenly could not coordinate their movements. The turning point came when Patricia's fleet executed a maneuver that the Council had never seen before. The human ships activated their quantum drives not to jump away, but to make micro-jumps within the battlefield itself. They disappeared from one position and reappeared seconds later in another, bypassing defensive lines and emerging in the midst of enemy formations. The tactic was dangerous, requiring split-second timing and precise calculations, but it transformed the battle. Council ships found themselves under fire from directions they had left undefended. Draxian battleship tried to bring its main guns to bear on the Valiant, but the human flagship jumped away before the weapons could fire. The battleship's targeting computer lost lock, and by the time it reacquired, the Valiant had already jumped again, this time appearing directly above the battleship's weakly armored dorsal section. Patricia gave the order to fire everything. Railguns, missiles, and laser batteries all opened up at point-blank range. The battleship's shields never had a chance. The vessel broke apart under the onslaught, its reactor core detonating in a flash that momentarily outshone the nearby star. Back in the Krillian system, Peterson received updates from the other battle zones. The Third Fleet had successfully neutralized the Draxian colony's defenses. The Fourth Fleet had captured Villan Prime's trade hub with minimal casualties. The Fifth Fleet had destroyed 3 major research stations. Across 12 Council systems, human forces were achieving their objectives with a speed and efficiency that was shocking even to those who had planned the campaign. The Council had not just underestimated humanity's military capability. They had fundamentally misunderstood the kind of enemy they were facing. The Krillian Defense Fleet was down to fewer than a dozen operational vessels. Their commander, a veteran named Zexilar who had served in the Council military for 40 years, broadcast a surrender signal. Peterson received the transmission and felt no sense of triumph. These aliens were not evil. They were soldiers following orders, defending their home from what they perceived as an unprovoked attack. The fact that humanity's attack was provoked, that it was a response to murder and injustice, would not matter to the Krillian families who had lost loved ones today. But Peterson also knew that mercy had its limits. He accepted Zexeler's surrender and ordered his fleet to cease fire on any Krillian vessel that powered down its weapons. Several ships complied immediately. A few tried to run for the outer system. Peterson let them go. There was no point in hunting down ships that no longer posed a threat. The objective had been to demonstrate Earth's capability, and that objective was achieved. The Krillian home system's defenses were in ruins. Their orbital infrastructure was crippled. They would need years to rebuild. Christine Ward reported an incoming transmission from Earth. Peterson took it in his ready room, away from the bridge crew. President Mitchell's face appeared on the screen, looking older than he had just days ago. The president congratulated Peterson on the victory, but there was no joy in his voice. He reported that other fleets were having similar success, but the cost was mounting. Earth had lost 11 ships and over 8,000 personnel. The numbers were small compared to Council losses, but each number represented a human life, a family that would receive notification, a future that would never happen. Mitchell gave Peterson his next orders. The First Fleet was to remain in the Krillian system and establish a blockade. No ships in or out without explicit human authorization. The Council needed to understand that Earth could not just strike their worlds but could hold them. The blockade would remain in effect until the Council agreed to negotiate. Peterson acknowledged the orders and returned to the bridge. The crew was celebrating their victory with quiet satisfaction. Brandon Cole was reviewing the battle recordings, analyzing what worked and what could be improved for next time. Maria Santos was coordinating repair teams to fix the damage the Retribution had taken. Alan Wright was organizing the blockade patrol patterns. They were good people doing a hard job, and Peterson was proud to serve with them. Outside the viewport, the planet below looked peaceful from orbit. The green and blue colors reminded Peterson of Earth. He wondered what the Krillians down there were thinking as they looked up at the wreckage in their sky. Did they understand why this had happened? Did they know about Daniel Cross and the execution that had sparked this war? Or did they simply see humans as invaders, as destroyers who had brought death to their system without warning or justification? The communication system beeped with an incoming message from Commander Helen Price. Her fleet had successfully engaged the Council military headquarters, but the fighting had been fierce. She had lost 6 ships, including 2 heavy cruisers. The station itself was heavily damaged but still operational. Helen was requesting additional support to finish the job. Peterson forwarded the request to Earth Command and received approval within minutes. He designated 5 ships from his fleet to jump to Helen's position and provide reinforcement. As those ships prepared to depart, Peterson thought about what would come next. The battles were going well, but battles were not wars. Eventually, the Council would adapt. They would learn from their losses and change their tactics. They would rally their scattered forces and mount a coordinated counterattack. Humanity had achieved surprise and initial success, but sustaining a military campaign across multiple star systems would strain Earth's resources to the breaking point. This war would not be won in days or weeks. It would be a grinding test of endurance and will. But for now, in this moment, humanity had proven something important. They had shown the galaxy that Earth could fight. They had demonstrated that the species the Council dismissed as primitives could build warships that matched or exceeded alien technology. They had earned respect through the oldest and most brutal method known to any civilization. They had made the powerful afraid. Sophie Turner's observation about Council command structures was already being incorporated into tactical doctrine. Every human commander now knew to target the flagships first. It was a small advantage, but wars were won by accumulating small advantages until they became decisive. The Krillian sun was setting on the planet below, casting long shadows across continents and oceans. In a few hours it would rise again on a world forever changed. The age of Council dominance was ending. What would replace it remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. Humanity would have a voice in shaping that future. And anyone who tried to silence that voice again would learn the same lesson the Krillians had learned today. 72 hours after the first human ships jumped into Council space, Admiral Vincent Hayes sat in the command center of the EDS Defiance and studied the casualty reports with tired eyes. 18 ships lost, 12,437 personnel dead. Another 3,000 wounded with injuries ranging from minor to critical. The numbers scrolled across his screen in neat columns that reduced human tragedy to data points. Each name represented someone who had left Earth believing in the mission, trusting their leaders, hoping to return home. Now they never would. Hayes had written letters to families before, back when he was a younger officer commanding smaller units. He would write more letters after this war ended. That burden came with the rank, but the Council losses were far worse. Hayes pulled up the intelligence summary compiled by Earth's reconnaissance drones. Over 300 Council vessels destroyed or disabled. 15 major military installations reduced to debris. 6 orbital stations captured intact. The Council's ability to project power across their territory had been crippled in just 3 days of fighting. Their navy, which they had believed invincible, had been revealed as a paper tiger built on outdated tactics and arrogant assumptions. The various alien species that made up the Council were already turning on each other, blaming everyone except themselves for the disaster. Hayes opened a secure channel to the other fleet commanders. Jake Peterson appeared first, his face showing the strain of maintaining a blockade around the Krillian homeworld. Helen Price joined next, reporting from the captured Council military headquarters. The station was a treasure trove of intelligence containing fleet dispositions, strategic plans, and communications that would keep Earth's analysts busy for years. Nicholas Hunt checked in from Draxian space, where his ships were enforcing a no-fly zone. Olivia Grant and Raymond Clark reported similar situations in their assigned sectors. The human fleets were spread thin across 12 star systems, but they were holding their positions. The discussion turned to next steps. Some commanders advocated for pressing the advantage, striking deeper into Council territory before the aliens could regroup. Others argued for consolidation, strengthening the positions they already held. Hayes listened to both sides and understood the appeal of each approach. But President Mitchell had given him clear instructions. Earth was not trying to conquer the galaxy. They were trying to force negotiations from a position of strength. That meant demonstrating capability without overextending to the point where losses became unsustainable. Hayes made his decision. The fleets would hold their current positions while Earth prepared for the next phase of the campaign. That phase would not involve more battles if things went according to plan. It would involve a demonstration so overwhelming that the Council would have no choice but to accept human terms. Hayes ended the conference and began composing the message he would send to President Mitchell. The President needed to authorize the use of Earth's most classified weapon, a device so destructive that its very existence had been kept secret from all but a handful of people. On Earth, Mitchell received Hayes's recommendation in the Situation Room, where he had spent most of the past 3 days. Lisa Grant stood beside him as they reviewed the proposal. The weapon in question was officially designated Project Godstrike, but everyone who knew about it called it the Planet Cracker. It had been developed in a black site laboratory on the far side of the moon, tested once in deep space where no Council sensors could detect it, and then placed in storage against the day it might be needed. That day had arrived. The physics behind the weapon were complex, but the effect was simple. It destabilized a planet's core, triggering a cascade reaction that would tear the world apart from within. The process was irreversible once started. Any planet struck by a Godstrike missile would break apart over the course of a few hours, its fragments scattering into an asteroid field that would remain for millions of years. It was genocide on a geological scale. The mere existence of such a weapon would have sparked outrage if the Council had known about it. Now that knowledge would serve as the ultimate negotiating tool. Mitchell gave his authorization. Lisa Grant transmitted the orders to Captain Ryan Foster, commander of the EDS Reckoning. Foster's ship was stationed at the edge of the Krillian system, with a single Godstrike missile in its launch bay. The captain was a quiet man who had spent 20 years in Earth submarine service before transferring to the Space Navy. He understood deterrence. He understood that sometimes the willingness to use a terrible weapon was enough to make its actual use unnecessary. Foster confirmed receipt of the orders and began target selection. The target was chosen carefully, not the Krillian homeworld that would make humanity into the monsters they were fighting against. Instead, Foster selected an uninhabited moon in the outer system. The moon was large enough to provide a clear demonstration, but had no strategic value and certainly no population. It would serve the purpose without causing unnecessary death. Foster ran the calculations 3 times to ensure accuracy. The margin for error on a weapon this powerful was effectively zero. One mistake and the missile could miss entirely or worse, hit something unintended. The council chambers on the central station were in chaos. Representatives from dozens of species were shouting at each other in languages that the translation system struggled to process. Vexthor, the Krillian who had presided over Daniel Cross's execution, sat silently in his throne watching his carefully constructed authority crumble. 3 species had already announced they were withdrawing from the council. Others were demanding Vexthor's arrest and trial for starting a war that was destroying them all. The chamber fell silent when a human transmission began broadcasting on every screen and speaker. President Mitchell's face appeared. He looked directly at the camera with an expression that conveyed both strength and weariness. His words were chosen with precision. He began by stating the facts without embellishment. Ambassador Daniel Cross had been executed on false charges. Earth had responded with military force. The Council's fleets had been defeated in every major engagement. Human forces now occupied or blockaded 12 Council systems. This could have been avoided. The Council had chosen violence and received violence in return. Mitchell laid out Earth's demands. First, the Galactic Council would be dissolved immediately. Second, all species including humanity would have equal representation in whatever government replaced it. Third, Vexthor and those responsible for Daniel Cross's execution would be surrendered to human custody to face trial. Fourth, the Council would pay reparations to Earth for the costs of the war and to the families of those killed. Fifth, all Council military forces would stand down and accept human inspection to ensure compliance. The demands were non-negotiable. The Council had 48 hours to respond. Then Mitchell added the final element that would make refusal impossible. He gestured off camera and the transmission switched to a view from the EDS reckoning. Captain Foster's voice provided calm narration as the ship's external cameras focused on the Krillian moon. The missile launched from the reckoning's bay, its drive flaring bright against the darkness of space. The weapon crossed the distance to the moon in just under 2 minutes. There was no explosion when it struck the surface. For several seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then the moon began to shake. Cracks appeared across its surface, glowing from within with heat that should not have been possible. The cracks widened and spread, forming a network that covered the entire visible hemisphere. Massive chunks of rock began to separate from the main body, pushed apart by forces originating from the moon's core. Within an hour, the moon was no longer a single object but a cluster of fragments held together by weakening gravity. By the 3rd hour, those fragments were drifting apart, creating a debris field that would eventually spread across the moon's former orbital path. The transmission returned to President Mitchell. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, but every word carried weight. The weapon demonstrated on the uninhabited moon could be used on any planet in Council space. Earth had the capability to destroy worlds. Humanity hoped they would never need to prove that capability on an inhabited target. But if the Council refused to negotiate, if they continued this war, then Earth would do what was necessary to ensure their own survival. Each choice belonged to the Council. Choose peace and negotiation. Choose continued war and face consequences that would echo through history. The transmission ended. In the Council chambers, the silence was absolute. Representatives stared at the screen showing the disintegrating moon. They had all seen the same thing and they all understood the implications. Humanity possessed planet-killing weapons. The species they had dismissed as primitives, the ambassadors they had executed to make an example, could now render entire worlds uninhabitable. The balance of power had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. Vexthor rose from his throne, but before he could speak, 2 Krillian guards seized him. His own species had decided that sacrificing one leader was preferable to seeing their homeworld destroyed. Other council members began calling for immediate surrender. A few held out for continued resistance, but their voices were drowned out by those who understood that further fighting was suicide. The council secretary called for a formal vote on accepting Earth's terms. On the retribution, Jake Peterson watched the vote tally appear on his display. The result was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 38 species voted to accept human demands. 4 voted to continue fighting. The abstentions did not matter. The council as it had existed for 10,000 years was finished. Peterson felt no sense of victory. Too many had died for this moment to feel like triumph. But at least it was over. The fighting would stop. The killing would end. Humanity could begin the hard work of building whatever came next. Admiral Hayes received confirmation from Earth that the Council's acceptance was genuine. Diplomatic teams were already preparing to travel to neutral territory for formal negotiations. The various human fleets would maintain their positions until a treaty was signed, but they were authorized to provide humanitarian assistance to damaged Council installations. Hayes issued the orders and allowed himself a moment to feel the exhaustion that had been building for days. He thought about Daniel Cross, the man whose death had started all of this. The ambassador would never know that his sacrifice had changed the course of galactic history. Captain Ryan Foster guided the reckoning away from the debris field that had once been a moon. His crew was quiet, processing what they had just done. They had not killed anyone, but they had demonstrated humanity's capacity for destruction on a scale that was almost incomprehensible. Foster wondered if that made them heroes or villains. Perhaps they were both. Perhaps in the cold mathematics of interstellar politics, such distinctions did not matter. What mattered was that Earth had secured a future where humanity would be respected, feared, and most importantly, left alone. The stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the brief violent drama that had played out among them. Somewhere in those stars, other species watched and learned. The humans were not to be underestimated. They were not to be threatened. They came from a small blue world in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, but they had proven themselves capable of standing among the great powers. The age of Council dominance was over. The age of humanity had begun. What they would do with that power remained to be seen. But one thing was certain beyond any doubt: no one would ever execute a human ambassador again,